Hello my lovely photogs, welcome back to another video. Welcome back to a new video on the series about visual patterns. The series will be break down visual language into visual patterns so that we can better understand the heuristics of photography and how better to apply them to our work. Now, again, if you don't know what any of those things are, then feel free to check out the very first video where I break down exactly what visual language is, what visual patterns are, and why you would use them over, say, something like photography rules. So today's visual pattern is a pattern that I'm sure you already know all about and that you've probably used yourself, but it's one of those patterns that, because it's so commonly used and because I feel it is such an important pattern to know, I feel it would be criminal to not include it in this series anyway. And that pattern is scale. When you use scale in photography, it can often be used as a way to evoke emotions like awe or wonder or grandiosity, or it could even be used the other way and used to evoke emotions like loneliness or isolation if you really wanted to as well. And you've almost certainly seen scale in action before, you know, a gigantically huge and vast landscape and this tiny little human just to show the scale of the image. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's a gigantic subject, right, in a sea of smaller little subjects as well. It could go either way. And all of these types of shots, all of these executions of visual patterns are really interesting. But why and how does scale actually work? That's what we're going to be addressing in this video. So it all has to do with two things: reference and proportion. So this is a photo of my friend Ollie on a big salt lake. Now, when it comes to scale, there's two things about this photo that make it work. And the first thing is that Ollie in the center here is the reference point. Now, humans in general make a great reference point because they're very relatable. Everyone knows the general size of how big humans should be. And so it's very easy as the viewer to put yourself in that position to experience that as the reference point, right? It's easy for us to understand. Now, the second thing that's important here is the proportion of him in this overall composition. The proportion of him as a reference point versus the rest of the entire image, the context that the reference point is surrounded in, gives him that sense of scale. If we compare Ollie to the rest of the photo, he's pretty damn small in the overall photo, right? And it is that size, the proportion of him versus the rest of the image, that gives the image a sense of scale. And so now we know that scale is about two things. It's about the reference point, and then it's about the proportion of that reference point in context and in relation to the context that that reference point is surrounded in. But let's play around with this idea a little bit more. What if I told you that this image is actually just a crop and that the real image looks like this? And now things change just a little bit, right? The feeling of vastness changes if just by a little bit, if just by a couple of degrees. Now, in this composition, what we did was we introduced a ton more sky and negative space into this overall composition. And we also adjusted the location of Ollie just to bring him down the bottom here, but he's still in the center. But what really makes the degree of vastness and the idea of scale change in this image versus the last image is that his proportion relative to the rest of the composition is now a lot smaller. And so with scale, the smaller your reference point is in the image, the bigger the sense of scale the image ends up having, right? But what if I told you that, again, that this was a crop as well? What if the real image was actually this? And this is actually the real image now. I'm not just trolling, but this is the full-on like actual image that I originally took in this gigantic salt lake. And with this image now, we've introduced another element, another reference point to be able to visually anchor ourselves and imagine ourselves in this composition. So now we have the moon. And so the moon now as a reference point is contrasted with Ollie as a human-sized reference point. And now this is really interesting, right? Because we know that the moon has a particular size. We remember the moon having a particular size. We know that it gets bigger towards the horizon, and that the higher up it gets in the sky, the smaller it becomes, or that it changes size with a particular day of the month or what have you. But because we understand this as a viewer, we can say, okay, we roughly know what that size is. We roughly know what Ollie's size is as a human. Now we can really appreciate the vastness of the context that these two reference points are surrounded by. And that gives us a real true sense of the scale that is in this composition. Now, just to drive the point home just a little bit more, let's dive into just a couple more examples. So in this image, we've got a photo of a Buddha statue by my favorite Japanese architect, Tadao Ando. And in this image, what I'm doing is I'm using a very wide lens, which is a bit of a tip if you want to introduce scale easily into your photography. Use a wide lens because it often makes your elements smaller and gets more in the frame for that to be contrasted with. And in this image, I'm actually using a foreground element as my reference point. So in this image, I'm using this bed of coins, this donation table that you see as you're walking up to the Buddha statue. But the important thing here is that everyone knows how big coins are, or how small coins are in this case, right? Everyone knows the rough size of a coin. And so we can understand that when we're thinking about coins, in relation to the size of the rest of this overall composition, we can start to imagine, okay, the reference point of the size of a coin versus how big the Buddha statue takes up in this composition, just exactly how big this statue is in real life. And it is absolutely gigantic. Again, reference and proportion. And the more you can use references that people understand and that people can really imagine, especially when it comes to size, then the easier it is for them to understand the sense of scale in that overall composition. Now in this last image, I have Mount Fuji here in the background, and Mount Fuji relative to the rest of the elements in this image is absolutely gigantic. And if you have been to Japan before and you've been up close to Mount Fuji, you know that Mount Fuji is just humongous and it towers in front of you when you are very close to it. But in this image, the reason why the scale works is that it's actually the inverse. The reference point is gigantic in this image. It takes up almost 1/3 of the entire image versus the other smaller reference points in this image, which is, this bridge, which we know bridges are actually pretty huge, right? And all of these houses down here, these houses are tiny. They're tiny by comparison to what the size of Mount Fuji is. And so this contrast between these 2 points is what gives this image the sense of scale that it has. And so remember, when you're using scale in photography to evoke a sense of awe or grandiosity or vastness or whatever the case may be, remember that it's all about your reference point and the proportion of your reference point in relation to the overall context to which it's surrounded in. The smaller your reference point, the bigger the sense of scale. All right, that's it for this video. But before I go, I just wanted to quickly mention that next week, this time, I'll be launching my very, very first course. My Lightroom editing masterclass is 11 hours worth of content over 50 lessons that will take you from complete Lightroom beginner to complete Lightroom Pro. This is absolutely everything that I know about Lightroom all in one course, and it is the reason why I don't do a lot of Lightroom tutorials and a lot of Lightroom videos on this channel. It's because I wanted to create something that is, the most condensed version and will teach you the most amount of things in the shortest amount of time, and that's what this course is all about. Now, if you're interested, next week for the first 48 hours, there will be a little bit of a discount. So if you're interested in more details about the course, check out patk.com/Lightroom-masterclass for more info. All right, I hope to see you in the course, and I'll see you next week anyway. Until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.